And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Maxime Rejou-Mechain to give this week's seminar. And Maxime did his PhD at Montpellier at CNRS on working on Central African Republic forests and community ecology. And he did a postdoc at Toulouse with Jérôme Char, working on forest carbon issues. And then he spent a few years in India, at Pondicherry, in the Department of Geometrics, and worked a lot on Indian forests in particular, and maps and properties of Indian forests. And since 2016, he's had a permanent position at the AMAP lab at IRD, the French Institute for Sustainable Development, where he works on a range of issues around African forests in particular. And that's the topic of his work today, which was a focus of a recent paper in Nature. But also he was just telling me about the many years of work that went behind that outcome and that publication, and you'll hear more of that in the seminar. So thank you, Maxime, for presenting to us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Yadvinder. So should I share my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Is it fine?
That's good.
Yeah. Okay, just okay. So thank you very much, Yadvinder, for inviting me for this seminar. So, okay, the talk is entitled "The Ecology of Central African Forests: Insight from Massive Commercial Datasets." So the work that I will present to you here is the product of many collaboration, and so I do not list all the collaborators here, but okay, so there are numerous. Okay, so I will start the talk by stating why commercial inventories deserve attention in Central Africa. Then I will give a few and now quite old study examples where we use commercial datasets to provide insight into the Central African forest diversity. So I will start to present a study where we tested whether we can trust or not commercial inventories. And second study about studying the combined effect of soil and succession. A third one on the role of reproductive traits in community assembly. And I will finally detail more recent studies that we published in Nature, which is entitled "Unveiling African Rainforest Composition and Vulnerability to Global Change." Okay, so Central Africa hosts the second largest rainforest block in the world, containing approximately 200 million hectares of forest. So in Central Africa, the forest cover has declined by, we estimate that it has declined by 17% from the 1990 to today, which is less than what is what has been observed in South American forests or in South Asian forests, and especially on West African forests. But this forest decline is also expected to increase given that Central Africa is expected to have a large and rapid climate change. And also, more importantly, also more than half of the global population grows by 2050. As you can see from 2020, the population should stabilize both in South America and in Southeast Asia, but will steadily increase up to 2000, is predicted to steadily increase up to 2100. And this will seriously pose some problems to Central African forests. So, what about Central African forests compared to the other continents? So this is a figure that has been published by Sullivan et al. And showing that first, in terms of carbon, here the Central African forests, which are in orange and host more carbon than South American forests, but have similar stock as South Asian forests. In terms of diversity, and species richness, so Central African forests are known to have much less diversity than Southeast Asia or than in South American forests. And this mean diversity is still much lower than in Amazonia in comparable wet climate conditions. So I will not detail the reason for that, but there are numerous potential causes that have been discussed in the literature regarding this lower diversity, and it can be related to the present context, that the existence of a large abundance of megafauna and due to past climate history. So here, just to show what is the state of the knowledge, not out of the knowledge, but of the, the scientific data that we can get on this forest compared to the others. So this is work that has been published this year by Oliver Phillips, showing the amount of plots census over years in the forestplots.net network. And as you can see, both Central African forest and African forest and Southeast Asian forest have much less efforts in terms of sampling intensity in their forest. And so this can be due to some logistical difficulties. It's not really easy to work in Central African forest, and also to the political instabilities that really limit the investment in long-term plots. So if we look now at how these plots are distributed within the forest, so here on the left, you see that the plots that are established in South American forest cover most of the climate gradients that we found in this forest. You have in the x-axis the mean annual temperature and the mean annual precipitation that are displayed in gray in the background. And you see that the plots are well representative of these gradients, which is not the case in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So the consequence of that is that usually the literature about rainforest diversity often lacks reference to Africa data. And just a very simple example, just if you just type Central African forest in Google Scholar or Amazonian forest, you have approximately 10 times more reference about Amazonian forest than Central African forest. And this is still true if we consider also Congo Basin forest and etc. So here, I will talk about the commercial inventories, how commercial inventories can help to give more information about this forest. So this map represents two different land uses. In blue, you have the protected areas that cover 15% of the forest in Central Africa. And in yellow or red, you have the logging concessions. And in yellow, the concessions that already have an approved management plan, and the one in red that do not yet have an approved management plan. So the management plan consists in designing sustainable logging, theoretical sustainable logging, so that for that they have to build some inventories to quantify the resources and organize their logging activities. So let's just focus on one example of one concession. This is one concession from Central African Republic. And as you can see, in a single concession, you can have more than 6,000 plots of 0.5 hectares. So this is already on only one concession. It's a huge data set. So this data consists in continuous transects where you have usually, not all the plots are like this, but most of them are like this, 0.5 hectare plots that are contiguous along these transects. So within these 0.5 hectare plots, you have generally all the trees superior to 30 centimeters identified and measured for their diameter. And in a quarter of the plot, you have trees superior to 10 centimeters in diameter. So given the huge amount of logging concession and the huge amount of data that can be available, we believe that this data, commercial inventory data, may constitute a strong opportunity to explore Central African forest diversity. The question is, can we trust this kind of data? So in a paper published in 2011, we used a data set of botanical controls that were performed in 4 concessions in Central African Republic. So we focus on more than 1,000 plots that have been controlled within 1 month from the original inventory on 4 forest concessions, and it consists in a control of 50,000 trees. So the first result is that the number of trees per plot is highly correlated, was highly correlated between the control and the original plot, with a Spearman of almost 1. The quality of the floristic determination is, however, lower for smaller trees. This means that people from the ground in the field pay less attention to identify species, small-sized species compared to large-sized species. And as expected, also the floristic determination is higher for, is better for abundant species. Rare species are less well recognized, but this was fully expected. So more importantly, we look at whether the alpha and beta diversity patterns, if they were consistent between the control and the original plots. So here you have the 4 concessions, and you have here the alpha diversity pattern, species richness, the inverse of Simpson, which give more importance to abundant species. And here the beta diversity that was quantified through correspondence analysis using the 2 first axes. So as you can see, the correlation between the control and the initial plots were pretty high of 0.8, indicating that we probably can trust the data, the patterns of diversity that are provided by this kind of data. So I will give 2 examples of studies that we did in the past on restricted areas. So here, work that have been conducted in Central African Republic, where we wanted to assess the combined effect of soil and succession. So many works have worked on the effect of succession and of soil on community assembly in tropical forests, but few works have really assessed the interaction between these 2 processes. So here we used 4 concessions, so consisting in 15,000 plots covering an area of more than 8,000 square kilometers. And these plots were covering 2 major soil types, the sandy soils and the clay soils. So the sandy soils are really nutrient poor and really probably prone to water stress. We use 93 species for which we were able to get 6 traits from the literature. So just to say that it's really difficult to find traits for Central African trees. If you look at, for instance, the tri database, it's really difficult to get data on this compared to Amazonian forest, for instance. So we got, I would call soft traits from the literature. And those species represent 72% of the stems originally inventory. And we built a successional index based on the pioneer proportions that we validated using some historical data that we get. I will show you later what kind of historical data we can get on those areas. So the first results were that here we assess, so on the x-axis, you can see the succession. So you have early successional forest near 0. And as you go on the right, you have late successional forest. You have the alpha beta diversity here on the first column, beta diversity, alpha and beta. On the left, you have the sandy soils. On the right, you have the clay soils. The first row is the taxonomic composition, and the second row is the functional composition. So the first thing is that early successional communities are not locally diverse. So as you can see, we have a fairly low taxonomic alpha diversity at the earlier succession, early successional forest, and higher taxonomic diversity. We have a more M-shaped pattern for functional with no difference in terms of functional diversity between early and late successional forest. But what is important is that the beta diversity also is much more higher in early successional forests than at the late succession, which is probably due to the fact that at the landscape scale, the diversity of disturbance, the history of disturbance have made much more heterogeneous communities in early successional communities. So then we also assess using this succession, the traits, how the mean trait value increase along succession. So what is the first result is that globally, the trends were the same between the 2 soil types. So with an increase of animal dispersed species along succession, decrease of deciduousness along succession, an increase of wood density along succession, decrease of nitrogen fixing species along succession, which is also expected given that nitrogen is known to be more limiting in early succession than in late succession. No clear impact of leaf area, and decreasing size of the maximum diameter, which is a particularity of Central African forests, where pioneer species are often long-lived and can attain a very large diameter. So this is not the realized diameter, which it is the potential maximum diameter. Okay, yes, and just to give a few difference in terms of soil types, so you can see that the sandy soils are characterized by more evergreen species. The deciduousness is much higher on clay soils. The wood density is much higher on sandy soils than in clay soil, and etc. I cannot go into much more detail. But what we show is that this effect of soil tend to vanish along succession. So here you have still the successional gradients, and here you have the functional beta diversity between soil types. That means that we compare for a given successional statute the beta diversity between plots of different soil types. And what we show is that the beta diversity tend to really decrease a lot at the first step of the succession, and then stabilize. And we think that there are two potential explanations for that. So the first one is that we know that soil resources become more uniform in the course of succession, so that the effect of this of soil may be more important at the beginning of the succession. And the second one is that adaptation for fast growth is now to entail a greater mortality risk on resource poor than on resource rich soil, so that early successional species may experience higher differential cost between soil conditions, which make maybe which lead to the fact that pioneer species may had better had to adapt it to adapt to different soil conditions. So now we'll talk about another study where we use the importance of reproductive traits on community assembly. So up to now, little attention has been given to how reproductive traits may influence community assembly in tropical forest. So we use the same data set as I described just before, but this time we were able to assign to each plot statute that the forest had in 1950s. So for this, we used aerial campaigns that were conducted in 1950s by the French National Institute, Geographical Institute, and that produced high resolution images, photographs that were then interpreted to depict what was savanna, degraded forest, or mature forest. And then we assess, using the data set, the percentage of dioecious, the percentage of individuals that are dioecious. So dioecious is the fact that dioecious species are species where male flower and female flower are on different individuals. So contrary to hermaphrodite species that can have both male and female flowers. And as you can see, it's really, so the first thing is that we did not see any effect of soil types this time. But the thing that is really interesting is that we have a very strong signal with a much higher abundance of dioecious individuals in the previously disturbed environments. And this is also true when we used present substance data. So that's this is really a robust pattern. So we can see, we can also say that, okay, but this pattern may be driven by other traits. So we use different traits, so such as leaf area, animal dispersal, wood density, nitrogen fixing, so the same traits as I showed before. And so if you look at the left here, this is the equivalent of a PCA, where we look at the association between traits. So as you can see, as already known from the literature, dioecious species tend to be animal dispersed, but they tend to be opposed to some traits here, the wind dispersed, deciduous, and maximum diameters that we just saw before, that were traits that were positively influenced by disturbance, so that were higher for early successional forest. And when we constrain this analysis by the successional statute, dioecious become the most predictive traits, the trait that is the most associated to young successional forest, and independently from the trait to which it tends to be correlated from LA or leaf area or animal dispersed. So that means that dioecious is significantly associated with young succession, but independently from other traits. So in fact, when we started to do this work, we had the opposite. Expectation. So the Baker in 1973 formulated a law which was that ideal colonizers should be able to self-fertilize to avoid dependence on pollinator on mates. Whenever they come to a young bare soil, for instance, you have an advantage to be a hermaphrodite because you can mate yourself, basically. But we have two potential explanations for our results. The first one is that under stressful conditions, monomorphic species, which are either hermaphrodite or monoecious, may invest more in the male function, reducing their demographic advantage over dioecious species. So this is something that have been shown for genodioic species that are species that have plasticity in their reproductive systems, and that where the male function predominate in stressful condition. And these observations were done first by Darwin, in fact. The second explanation is because of the seed shadow handicap and of the pollen limitation of dioecious species, evolution is expected to lead to a positive association between dioecious and dispersal ability. So the seed shadow handicap is because only female produce seeds. Generally, the dioecious species tend to be more aggregated in space, so that they tend to be more influenced by density-dependent processes, and so that to counteract this density-dependent effect, we think that evolutionarily they have to increase their dispersal ability. And just a note to move from the Central African forest, if you look at the other continents, the most emblematic pioneers, Cecropia or Puruma from the neotropics or Macaranga from Asia, are all dioecious also. So now I will present you works that more recent works that we published this year, which is called Unveiling African Rainforest Composition Vulnerability to Global Change. So this is a product of a collaboration with many experts of African flora, with the private sector, with statisticians, and etc. So as said before, Africa is forecasted to experience both an important climate change and a huge population growth, which will likely impact a lot this forest. And to preserve this second largest rainforest block, we need for actions. But to build for actions, action for management or conservation. But to do that, we need a better understanding of their compositional heterogeneity, the environmental drivers of forest composition, and their vulnerability to global ongoing changes. So this time we work at the scale of Central Africa. So we work on an unprecedented data set that needed more than 10 years of collaboration, cleaning, assembly procedures, working with taxonomists, working with informaticians, and etc. It took really a long time to assemble this data set. So the data set consists in more than 185,000 plots, so covering 90,000 hectares of forest. So it contains 6 million trees superior to 30 centimeters in diameter. And we focus on 183 dominant tree taxa that represent 90% of the total number of individual originally inventory. So just to give an idea that we estimate that reproducing this data set for a single researcher would take 1,000 years of work on the field in continuous time. So another aspect that is important is that this data set that you can see here in black is representative of 85% of the Central African forest climate conditions, which make it interesting to make prediction at large scale and to make extrapolation. So the objective of this study was to produce the first quantitative floristic and functional compositional map of Central African forest and to predict their vulnerability to ongoing changes. So we use three sets of predictors. The first one is climate predictors, 24 variables from the CRU database. We developed anthropogenic index that we developed specifically for this study. I will explain why just after. And we use the soil types, but that we consider only to opposing clay soil to sandy soils. According to preliminary analysis, the other soil type were not really important. So why did we design a specific anthropogenic index while some indices, anthropogenic indices are already available in the literature? So there are two main reasons for that. The first one is that this kind of indices usually, so that are published at the global scale, usually rely on administrative statistics. And we can see here, for instance, on this on those data sets that we have sharp transition in the human pressure that is only due to administrative boundaries. And this boundaries, this sharp transition had a huge impact in our model at the end. The second limit of this data set is that they consist in cumulative layers. They add thread by thread like this, and so that there is no mechanistic behavior behind that, so that we cannot make any projection using scenarios. So we decided to build a very simple index based on the population place with a population size and the distance to the transport network. Basically, the index is a probability to be impacted by human activities, which is a ratio between the influence of the population and of the proximity of roads. And what is interesting is that this index need only to be calibrated with only one parameter, the theta parameter here. And it is here an illustration on the impact of the increasing the theta parameter. So you see that as theta increase, the disturbance are predicted to be far away from the cities, but preferentially along roads. And it is what is observed on the field and from satellite imageries, for instance. So we calibrated this parameter using MODIS data, but focusing only on two calibration areas that we well knew, and for which we know that there were not that much problem of atmospheric pollution as compared to the Atlantic coast. And so that, as you can see here, you have in light green the forests that are likely to be disturbed according to their spectral signature. And as you can see, they preferentially occur along roads. So interestingly, this index that was fully developed independently from our datasets much better predicted the percentage of pioneer, the composition in terms of wood density than the previously published indices. So was quite interesting that just building on a very simple model, which is a quite mechanistic, so that we can make some projection with it, as I will say later, is finally has a better predictive power than some indices that consist of many layers, and which is hard at the end to understand. Okay, so the statistical model that we use is a new framework that is called supervised component generalized linear regression, which is a multivariate extension of partial least square methods. So basically, it consists in selecting common climate components that can predict at best the abundance of the taxa. So contrary to a PCA, for instance, that would look only at the correlations that you have between the climate variable, but that would not give any information about whether the components selected are important for predicting species abundance or not. Here, this method is using through cross-validation procedures a trade-off between the structures that you can represent in your variables, your climate variables, and the predictive powers that you have on your data sets. So we then use a GLM, general linear model, to predict the abundance of the 183 taxa using the components selected, the climate components, and using anthropogenic index and soil type as additional variable. We then extrapolate the abundance, the predicted abundance over the whole Central Africa, and we assess the validity of our model using spatial cross-validation, as we recommended in a recent paper, where we use clusters of plots, spatial cluster of plots that we left out the calibration procedure and use it to validate our approach, our predictions. So the results show that we have three main climatic determinants that influence the composition of Central African forest. The first one, the most important one, is oppose the cool and light deficient dry season in the Atlantic coast to high evapotranspiration rate at the north of the Congo Basin. The second component opposes seasonal versus seasonal forests. So basically, forest from the equator versus forest at the fringe of the forest of the domain. And the last component opposes cool versus hot areas in terms of maximum temperature. So here are three examples of predictions that we did at the taxa level. So the Okumia cliniana, where our climatic determinants were the most important to predict their distribution. The Musanga secropioides, which is a well-known pioneer species, so short-lived pioneer species, which was highly influenced by anthropogenic pressure. As we see that a higher abundance along the roads. And lastly, the Manicara species that were already well-known to be very associated to sandy soils. So the mean, so at least in Central Africa. So the mean correlation was of 0.48 globally, and it was still of 0.45 when we consider only the site where we have positive abundances. So that means that beyond just predicting the presence of absence of species, we were able to predict the abundance within their species range. The problem is that because climate data and species can be both spatially, so are spatially aggregated at large scale, we can just have predictions that may appear by chance, so correlations that may appear by chance, meaning that we can predict species only through the spatial properties of the climate determinant, but not through really link between climate and distribution. So to test that, we use the three observed component climate component, and we simulated 500 spatialized neural models where we used randomly we reproduce randomly this climate components, but preserving the spatial correlation, the spatial properties of this climate components, and preserving their co-spatial structure as well. So this dataset shows that climate may correlate with abundance by chance only for 2/3 of the taxa, which indicates that it's highly risky to make some projection at the taxa level, given that you have no insurance that there is a really a clear link with climate data, but it may be just due to the good projections through the spatial structure of these variables. So then we combine all the species abundances, the predicted abundances, and that we submitted to a correspondence analysis. So that give the three main gradients, floristic gradients over the Central Africa. So the axis 1, axis 2, and axis 3. And as you can see, the correlation between observed and predicted gradients were very high, with 0.9 for the first gradient, 0.7 for the second, 0.6 for the third one. So here, this map represents red, blue, green composite of these three first axes. So similar colors display similar taxonomic composition, and dissimilar color, dissimilar taxonomic composition. And here, running again our null model indicates that the association between climate and floristic assemblage is robust to spatial autocorrelation. So why do we have a more link between communities and climate than with taxon, with individual taxon with climates? So we believe that individual taxon abundances are partly affected by unknown past human disturbances, biotic interaction, and biogeographical history. And this idiosyncratic effect tend to average out at the community level, so revealing highly deterministic assemblages. So we then use three functional traits to predict the function over Central Africa. So the wood density here that was primarily impacted by human disturbance, so with low wood density in high anthropogenic areas, and with also by soil types where you have very high wood density in sandy soils. So the deciduousness that were primarily driven by the first component, climate component, with a gradient from Atlantic forest to the north, with just an exception on the sandy soils where, as shown before, the evergreenness is higher on these sandy soils. And the maximum diameter, which was mostly linked to anthropogenic disturbances. So basically, what it shows here, so the prediction were very good for the deciduousness because there were really a very strong link between deciduousness and climate. But whenever we have the anthropogenic component in the traits, the correlation was smaller because it's extremely hard to capture anthropogenic disturbances, given that there are many historical disturbances that we cannot account for. So then we decided to produce a practical map displaying the main forest type over Central Africa. And the colors here represent RGB composition of the three functional traits. So similar color show similar functional composition and vice versa. So the hierarchical trees that we see on the right side show the relationship, the taxonomical relationship between the different forest types. So the first thing that we can see is that the most important differences between forest types is between the Gabonese forest type, the 1 to 3 forest type, and all the other forest types. The second, within these forest types, the semi-deciduous forest 4, 5, 6 distinguish clearly from the other group that are more located in Cameroon or DRC. So what is interesting is that despite very different taxonomic composition between the Gabonese group and other groups, we see that there are some convergence, functional convergence, similar colors between taxonomically very different floristic types. And this indicates, confirms that functional composition depend more on environmental conditions than taxonomic composition, which is more impacted by biogeographical history and etc. and by dispersal limitation. Okay, so now the question is how those 10 forest types may evolve in the future. So we used climate envelope, we built climate envelope, three-dimensional climate envelopes, focusing on the three first components, climate components, and build a concave, which is quite similar to convex hull for those that know that. And so that it represents the climate niche that this forest type currently has. And the question is, we try to see in the future using 18 climate models where those conditions can be found, will be found in the future, or predicted to be found in the future. So here it's for the 10 forest groups. You can see here the scale color indicates, so 5% indicates that basically that there is only one model out of the 18 that predicts that the climate can be found in again in the future for this, where the condition of this group will be found in the future. And 90% in blue is when the 18 model all agree between them. So in fact, not only it's 100, but most model agree. So what it shows is that most climate model predicts that current climate condition will either virtually disappear from Central Africa, for instance, the group 2 and the group 5, where in the future it is predicted that the condition currently existing within this forest type will not exist anymore, or the condition will move at spatial and temporal scales that are really not comparable with the ability of trees to disperse. So for instance, the group 4 here, you see the distance that the tree would have to follow to follow their actual current climate conditions. So this indicates that current forest community will not be able to track the present climate envelope and will face the emergence of novel climates, so in particular hotter climates, making the prediction of taxon distributions under future climate projection highly risky. So we decided not to project our correlative model because we were fully out of the calibration domain, in fact. So we decided that, okay, the information that we can get on today's forest may have some information about how forests may be vulnerable to the future changes. So we follow the IPCC recommendation where the vulnerability to climate change is estimated using 3 components, the sensitivity plus the exposure minus the adaptive capacity. So to estimate the sensitivity, we assume that assemblage dominated by taxa with narrow environmental tolerance currently will be more sensitive to upcoming changes. So basically, we use the inverse of the mean climate niche width at the community level. The exposure was quantified as the extent to which the current climate conditions are expected to change by 2085. So here we used again the 18 climate model combinations, and we compute the Euclidean distance between current and projected determinants, the CC, the 3 climate components. And lastly, the adaptive capacity, which was really challenging because we know very little about the adaptive capacity of tropical trees to changing climate, to climate change. So here we assume that higher local phylogenetic diversity provides a wider range of potential response to novel climate conditions. And this hypothesis was based on the fact that using a molecular phylogeny, we found that a significant niche conservatism along climate determinants, meaning that closely related species tend to share tend to live in similar climate conditions, so that if we mix different lineage, we have more chance to have at least one of the lineage that can respond favorably to a change. So basically, we use the phylogenetic diversity as the Shao abundance-based index that give more importance to abundance species. So I will not detail the resulting map, but basically we have a map for the sensitivity to current climate gradient, the exposure to forecasted climate change, and a map of phylogenetic diversity, which is that we consider as a proxy for adaptive capacity. And this gave us a map of the vulnerability to climate change that we then combine with the anthropogenic pressure predicted in 2085 using our index, anthropogenic index, where we use country-specific UN projection of population, African population in Central Africa. For instance, in Cameroon and DRC, from 2000 to 2085, it is predicted that the population will be multiplied by 7, which is huge. So in the x-axis here, you have the vulnerability to climate change, and the y-axis, the anthropogenic pressure. So in red, in green, excuse me, you have areas that are predicted to be not vulnerable to climate change and not impacted by anthropogenic pressure in 2085. In blue, so basically the north of the Congo and the trinational Sangha parts of the Central African forest. You have the blue area where you have you are not predicted to be under anthropogenic pressure by 2085, but under climate, you have predicted to be vulnerable to climate change. In pink, this is the worst case where you have predicted to be vulnerable to both. And in orange, such as in Cameroon or in south of Congo, where you are predicted to be vulnerable to the increase in population size in anthropogenic disturbances. So the most striking pattern here that we can see is that DRC, which is the countries that contain almost 50% of the forest from Central Africa, has most of its forests that are sensitive to, that are expected to be vulnerable to climate change or to population disturbance, to anthropogenic disturbances, or to both. So how can we use this kind of maps to protect Central African forests? So we are, this is not part of the paper. This is something that we are starting to discuss with the co-authors and other people. You're welcome to give your opinion on that. But the idea would be to use this map to give some area-specific recommendations. For instance, promote only certified logging concession and foster forest connectivities in the areas that are the less vulnerable, extend the coverage of protected area and maximize their connectivity where you will have strong, high vulnerability to climate change to maximize the chance of these forest communities to face climate change. And in highly anthropogenic areas, to promote restoration and plantation projects, and especially focusing on species adapted to climate change to maintain forest cover. So just to finish, we have again, I show already this, but we have two key land use to have to make some pressure on how we should manage or protect this forest. So the protected areas, which are covering 15% of the forest, but that really unequally cover the different forest types that we identified in this study, with some forest type really underrepresented. So maybe a first step would be to extend the protected area network to better represent the diversity of forest type in Central Africa. And the second one is a forest concession. And as you can see here, so at least in the western side, most of the protected area are connected by forest concession. And if these forest concessions are well managed, if we can have good practices, we can expect that the forest cover can be maintained and that these areas can act as corridors between protected areas. But something that is of concern is in DRC again, that a lot of forests are non-attributed for now. They are not under any legislation, and which is really concerning because that means that there is no tool to make action on these areas. And we know that currently these areas are under a high rate of deforestation and degradation. So thank you very much for your attention. You're welcome to ask questions. Just for kidding, the Nature paper has been published in this issue where the cover was a bit surprising, not related to our work, but we just hope that this is not a premonitory vision for African forest. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Maxime. Okay, I'd like to open it up to everyone for questions, and do feel free to switch on your camera. It's quite nice again to have faces in the audience for the discussion. I noticed Salome asked, is this talk going to be on YouTube? Yes, it is. We'll post this onto YouTube probably within a few hours, and feel free to share it with your students and colleagues there. Okay, would anybody want to kick off with a question? While we're waiting, I'll kick off with one while you're thinking of your questions. I was very curious about your map of functional diversity, phylogenetic diversity, and using that as a proxy for resilience as well, and how that was different from the map of climate vulnerability. If you were thinking of the African Pleistocene refugia model, you'd expect the areas that have the highest diversity would be the ones that historically have been the least vulnerable to climate change and would be the least vulnerable now. So what do you think? It seemed to be that if I didn't look at the maps closely enough, the map seemed to be a bit different from the classic Pleistocene refugia in all the distributions. So what's shaping the diversity, phylogenetic diversity, do you think, across Central Africa? You're muted.
Okay, yes, sorry. I did not see any link with the refugia. First, we only have some hypothesis on that, and no, there is no clear link with the refugia there, and I don't think that this dataset is highly appropriated for that, because we are only focusing on abundant species and not rare species. The refugia are maybe also expected to have more rare species and etc. So given that already we filter out the rare species or very endemic species, I think it's also a reason for what we should not expect any relationship with the refugia. But what was surprising is that what we found is that the primary driver of phylogenetic diversity was that you have a peak of phylogenetic diversity for intermediate precipitation regimes, and it has been published just so last year. So during the revision of this paper, there have been a paper coming out on Amazonian forests where they found the same, that the phylogenetic diversity peak for intermediate precipitation regimes, and they interpreted that as the consequence of a mix of wet and dry affiliated lineage.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But no, yes, regarding the link with refugia, I don't think that we can find something with this, at least with this data set.
Okay, great, fascinating. Anybody else have a question? Jesus?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was pretty cool to actually see the work actually explained after reading the paper. And I was wondering something related to what Jadvinder asked, but mostly linking the phylogeny into the actual kind of soft and hard traits that you show some of them, the distribution, you map them, but many of the others, let's say, linked to hydraulics or even linked to the morphology of leaves and chemistry are not there, as you mentioned, because this data is not widely available. But I was wondering, to what extent do you think most of these traits that you didn't include in there would have a link to the phylogenetic signal that you have in there, that they have this phylogenetic conservatism? Would you expect this to see in these other traits that may actually be quite important for the species to adapt to this changing climate? For instance, if you think about photosynthetic capacity or hydraulic conductivity, vessel diameter, etc.
Yes, definitely. So in fact, behind the idea of using the phylogenetic diversity as a proxy, it's clearly this idea that yes, you have a strong conservatism in traits that makes that if you have different lineage, you have much more, you expect to have more functional diversity. But as said just before, we really lack information on traits. So so with Felix that is here, we are working more on these phylogenetic patterns currently, and the original idea was to try to collect some traits for this species. So but the problem is that, okay, it's really a time-consuming work, and so we already have some traits that have been measured on herbariums. So especially, for instance, chemical traits or some traits linked to leaf size and etc. We would like to, but we do not have enough species for now to work at the community level, and we would like to expand this. But it's a huge work, in fact, spending a lot of time in the herbariums and etc. So the other option would be to go to the field and to organize mission for that. But yes. We need to find funds and people also for doing that.
And probably the other option, at least to start seeing if to what extent you have a match with the traits and the phylogeny and the distribution, probably would be to take some of the products that are already out there available based in climate and remote sensing or something like that, just as proxies, right? At least to start getting insights about the probable link, about the phylogeny, what you produce with the phylogeny, and if that is what you see, at least with the material that is already published.
Yeah, so you think about typically the spectral diversity using
for example.
Yeah, so I did not work on that specifically on Central African forest because as you may know on the Atlantic forest we have a very permanent cloud cover. It's really difficult to get cloud-free images and etc. And but we are working in the lab on that, and I also work on that on Thailand, where we are trying to see whether we can make a link between spectral diversity and taxonomic diversity and functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity, and for now we failed to find any relationship, and we believe that so for now, so we have not finished those analyses, but for now we think that most of the signal, if we have some signal relationship in fact, but they are mostly due to the structure of forest. Basically that we can capture easily young successional versus a late successional forest because just you have a heterogeneity in terms of textures that translate into heterogeneity also spectral response. So the spectral response is not just a spectral response, you also have textural based influence in that. So at the scale of Central Africa, I think that we are far from being able to do this, but I may be wrong. At least, okay, that would be worth trying, but I really have some doubt that we can find a relationship with that.
That's cool. I've just mentioned it because so we have been working on that, and we are already working also on that through the gem plots from Jadvinder. It's some plots in Africa, but also in Malaysia and Australia and South America. So it would be nice to continue chatting about this and see how it develops.
Yes, for sure. And I think that really, so what we observed because we got very high resolution data in Thailandese forests is really the preliminary results indicate that we have a relationship with diversity, but it's really mediated by the texture, the forest structure, not really. So the hypothesis that really we are capturing a diversity of spectral response, and that this is a diversity of spectral response that induce the signal is unlikely, at least in our study site.
Thank you.
It would be interesting to, I'm willing to discuss more on this.
Thanks.
Great. John Palmer, you have a question. Would you like to ask it directly, or should I channel it? Okay, I'll ask it directly. Actually, I'll generalize it slightly. So John asks whether how many of the plots have data or anthropogenic charcoal shards, and I suspect your answer is going to be you don't know because they haven't been sampled. But more generally, how much do you think past anthropogenic disturbance is shaping the patterns that you're seeing? We know even about 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, those areas that are now quite intact, where you see lots of evidence of oil palm agriculture, etc. So to what extent do you think the patterns that you're seeing are shaped by past human disturbance?
Yeah, so I think it's the most important factors that we are missing, in fact. So wherever you go in Central Africa, you will find a lot of charcoal spots and etc. So definitely this forest have been heavily impacted by all disturbances. So except on the sandy soils that I show to you, because these sandy soils, there are a lot of distance between the rivers there, and the water is really lacking. So it's not favorable for having a human settlement there. But everywhere else, you have a lot of impact. So I don't know. Okay, just if you consider the 1950 map that I showed before for the diocese work, the work on diocese, you can see how previous disturbances in 1950s, and since then the villages are not at the same place, but you can see how the signatures that it's left on the functional composition of forests. It's huge. And so here we are just speaking about 50 or 1,000 years, but many other works suggest that the legacy of these disturbances, all disturbances may stay for very long. For instance, I work on the project in French Guiana, where we work on the Nourag site. I don't know if you know this, but it was one of the sites considered as a very mature forest, undisturbed forest, and etc. And so we went there with archaeologists and with soil specialists and with local people that had local knowledge and etc. And establishing plot there, we were able to see, okay, the first driver of plot composition was the geological substrates, but the second one was anthropogenic disturbances, and it was strong, and it was disturbances that occurred more than 400 of years. Mm-hmm. And it is still the second most important gradient in an area where we know that nobody came since the 300 last years. So in Africa, where we in the 1950s, the French colonial government, at least in the countries that were under the French administration, the politic was to bring all the people near to the roads, to concentrate people around the roads, and etc. There were much more people spread in the forest than today, much more. There are very interesting maps that I can show if you are interested. I can share about some areas in Gabon where you can see the location of the village in 1910, 9,009. Okay, 1,000 and
you're right.
100 years back, and you see plenty of villages all over the landscape. Okay, plenty. And today you have only a few villages, but big villages, but a few villages. So all these forests that are currently considered as mature forest, undisturbed forests, were disturbed 100 years back a lot, and we don't know where, we don't know to what extent, and it's extremely difficult to predict the impact, and the impact is likely to be very long.
Mm-hmm. Just going to pick up on your Nourag example, what were the, so you're seeing legacies from disturbance 400 years ago. What type of ecological patterns were you seeing? Was it a general trend to certain functional groups or clay?
Yeah, so we found that, we were looking for the impact, in this specific project, we were looking for the impact of human activities on the bacterial composition, the fungi composition, the tree composition, and the earthworm composition. So we found that, surprisingly, we found no impact on fungi communities or in earthworm communities, but a strong impact on bacterial and trees. For the bacterial, we are still working on that to see whether we can identify some functional groups that can be identified that were favored by previous activities. But for the trees, a study conducted at larger scale shows that basically, if we consider, so it's a strong assumption, but if we consider the current uses of these trees, so taken from ethnological surveys, and that we classify the trees into trees that are good for food, or trees that are good for building houses. So what we found is that we get a significantly higher abundance of species that were good for food, where we can that produce food, and a lower abundance of trees that were used for construction. So the question is always the egg and chicken. So do people really did that? So bring seeds and etc. by eating and enrich the forest by getting more species that feed people, and then because they built a house and etc., they diminish the size of the population of, or is it because humans usually tend to go where there are more resources, food resources? So it's always the same problem. Whenever we work with human, it's really difficult to find the causal way for that. But
okay, interesting. Okay.
But we are still working on that for the NURAG sites, and trying to see. We did not see any effect on the functional composition using chemical traits or using yes, wood density. Also, no signal for that. So for now, we have no explanation on potential consequences in terms of forest functioning.
Okay, interesting. Okay, any more questions? Okay, I'll kick in with one last one. I was curious about your comment about the maximum diameter of trees, and how certainly in the African forest, and the ones I know in Ghana, certainly in Gabon, this is certainly true, the pioneers, or the long-lived pioneers, seem to have very large diameters, and you have this sort of strange sequence of very high biomass when they mature, which then possibly decreases when you get further along. And is this I think you suggested maybe particularly a feature of African forests rather than the tropics generally. Do you think that's the case, or is there, and if it is, well, why?
So, okay, so I have more experience on African forests, but okay, when you see the diversity of short-lived pioneer species, both in Amazonia and in Asia, I think it's so they are much more diverse than in Africa. Basically, in Africa, you have one really dominating taxon, which is a Musanga secropioides, but you have plenty of functionally similar species in, at least in Amazonia. You have plenty of Cecropia species and etc. So in Central Africa, yes. So okay, the best I know from Central African forests, so the Musanga species or some Macaranga species, yes, definitely they are short-lived, but even compared to their the short-lived pioneer species from Amazonia, for instance, they have a longer life. Musanga has a longer life than any Cecropia species in Amazonia. So Cecropia species may typically be 40, 50 years old, but in Africa it can be much more, and they can attend. I don't know if you already saw that, but some Musanga, we can have 1 meter diameter Musanga. I already saw that, for instance, in the Baiki experimental site, you have very large size this pioneer taxa. And okay, I don't know if it's really a specificity because I did not really specifically study that, but yes, it was striking for me that the young successional communities in Central Africa were really more dominated by long-lived pioneer taxa than in what I've seen in. I'm not saying that there is no long-lived pioneer taxa in other biomes, but they are much less abundant. Okay, to the feelings that I had.
Really. And this is very much my impression as well. And I haven't analysed it in any sense, but I get that impression when I'm in these West African and Central African forests, that you see these clear pioneer species that are hundreds of years old, Lofira, Lata, and others as well in Gabon. And Okume is a classic one, I think.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. Which are all the issues.
Yes, yeah. And I don't come across that functional group very often in Amazonia. Or maybe it's just not identified so clearly as a distinct functional group. Yeah. And I have no clear explanation of why that would be, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, it might be really interesting to compare this. I don't know if we can get some data for that, but yes, I think it would be interesting to test if really this feeling is true or not, because it would be very instructive for the Central African forest ecology.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Sanish, you have a question?
Yeah, it's I remember one of the maps that he presented, the results modeling functional composition with a red, green, and blue map. So I was just wondering, connecting to your question, so whether this wood density is composed of trees with less hardiness. I mean, in terms of I don't know if we can go back to the slide.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's the slide is like results modeling, something results model.
Okay.
Not this.
This one?
Yeah, this one. So I was just thinking, looking at this. So the wood density is composed of like less useful trees, or how are they, like what is the how do people see the plants? Like now the density is composed of less useful plants, or
So what do you mean by less useful?
as in like for example, like some trees are very good for firewood and some are not very good because of their burning duration. So you know, the for example, furniture, some trees are very good for furniture, some are very good for fuel wood, some are good for construction,
Okay, so
like
okay, so
used by the people.
okay, so low wood density species. So okay, I would speak about the timber value, if you want. Timber value would be okay. The timber value. So low wood density species are not necessarily do not necessarily have a low timber value. In fact, so for instance, I think one of the top logged tree species in Africa is Triplochiton sclerosilon, and the wood density is of 0.3, so it's a very low wood density, but they are highly logged and very so the logging companies are really looking for those species, those trees. So I've not seen really a relationship between. I don't know if there is really a relationship between wood density and timber value. Okay, the wood what we can say is that the wood density definitely has a lower value for storing carbon, but otherwise, I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. There's a final question from John Palmer there. Is there any correlation between depopulation through the Atlantic slave trade, as suggested by the work by Eustace Jones in Nigeria? And could slave trade disruption explain part of the patterns we see of composition and diversity?
Okay, so this is very unknown, okay, for now. Yes, so definitely, for instance, in the Gabon, a lot of the places have been depopulated a lot. The forests have been depopulated a lot by the slave trade, but the extent to which this impacted the forest is really unknown for now. So we submitted a project last year about that, but it has been rejected. So it's really difficult to know that. So I would say yes, but yes, probably, but I'm not aware about any studies that really quantify that in Central Africa. Mm-hmm. And it's extremely challenging also to get data on that at large scale.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at that. I know from my experience of living and working in Ghana, there's a lot of evidence of extensive rural depopulation in the 1800s linked to the slave trade, either by people directly being taken as slaves, but more often moving into cities for protection and abandoning rural areas, yeah. and areas that were agricultural until 1800 became forest in 1900.
And how did you get those evidences?
Well, there's some evidence there is from some published work by some colleagues around Lake Busumtwi. It's this lake with a core with a deep core in the forest zone of Ghana, which shows extensive agriculture around 1800. There had become extensive forest cover by 1900 as well. So that particular area, there's quite strong evidence of this shift now, and I suspect it's true of much of West Africa, at least, and probably the coastal part of Central Africa as well.
Okay. So just for information, just okay, I'm currently leading a project that is working on, for those who know that, Marantacé forest. So these are forests that are very open with a lot of an understory of giant herbs and etc. So Felix, who is here, is a postdoc in the project. And basically, we think that there are legacy of human disturbances that may have occurred 1,000 years ago. There are evidences from charcoals and from pots that some of the large patches that occur in North Congo are due to disturbances that occurs 1,000 years ago, right. And that now these forests are maintaining through positive feedback mechanisms, through the competition between giant herbs and large trees, and also through fire events and etc. And we are currently working on that too. So yes, maybe the next talk I will have more information about the impact of historical disturbances on African forests, because this kind of forests are occurring in very numerous places in Central Africa and in North Congo especially. It's impressive.
Yes, and fascinating. There really seems to be accumulating evidence that these legacies can last for a long time. I know in Gabon, work by Lee White and Kate Abernethy and others suggests also the megafauna maintain this forest may be disturbed, and then the presence of elephants and gorillas and large herbivores maintain these forests for hundreds of years in this disturbed, stable state, rather than
this is extremely difficult to test. We need to have exposure and exposure, and excluding elephants is really a challenge. So. But yes, this is another mechanism that can explain how they can maintain and be an alternative stable state, maybe, of the dense forest.
Yeah. Okay, absolutely fascinating. So thank you. Congratulations also. It's great to see so many years of hard work and accumulating in a nice, really high impact publication as well. So congratulations on getting it to that as well. And we have a tradition in these seminars at the end to unmute your microphone so we can give an audible round of applause. So thank you for and have a wonderful weekend. I'll post this on YouTube sometime in the next few hours, and see you again.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a good weekend all. Thank you for attending.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.